The American dream says anyone can make it if they work hard enough. But what if you start with literally nothing? No family, no money, no hope. Babe Ruth proved that even the most abandoned child can become the most beloved hero. This is how it really happened. February 6, 1895. Baltimore, Maryland. George Herman Ruth Jr. was born into a world that didn't want him. His parents, George Cincher and Kate, ran a small saloon in one of Baltimore's roughest neighborhoods. The family lived above the bar where young George was exposed to drinking, fighting, and the harsh realities of poverty from his earliest memories. By the time George was 7 years old, his parents had given up on him entirely. The boy was wild, uncontrollable, and constantly getting into trouble. He skipped school more often than he attended. He stole from neighbors. He started fights with children twice his size. His parents, overwhelmed by their failing business and their own personal problems, saw their son as nothing more than another burden they couldn't afford to carry. On June 13, 1902, George Herman Ruth Cincher made a decision that would change American history forever, though he certainly didn't know it at the time. He took his 7-year-old son by the hand and walked him to the gates of St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys. St. Mary's wasn't just a school. It was a reformatory, an orphanage, and a last resort for children that society had labeled as incorrigible. The boys who ended up there were the ones nobody else wanted, the troublemakers, the abandoned, the forgotten. This is where you belong now, George Cincher told his son before walking away forever. Young George Herman Ruth Jr. watched his father disappear down the street, not understanding that he would never see him again. At 7 years old, he had become completely alone in the world. St. Mary's Industrial School was run by the Zabrian Brothers, a Catholic order dedicated to educating difficult children. The institution housed nearly 800 boys, ranging in age from infants to young men of 21. The philosophy was simple but harsh. Break down the child completely, then build them back up according to strict Catholic principles. The daily routine was brutal by today's standards. Boys woke at 5:30 a.m. for prayers, followed by Mass, then breakfast. Academic classes ran from 8 a.m. to noon, followed by trade instruction in the afternoon. Boys learned shoemaking, tailoring, carpentry, or printing, skills designed to turn them into productive members of the working class. Discipline was swift and severe. Boys who broke rules faced corporal punishment, solitary confinement, or loss of meals. The brothers believed that only through complete submission could these damaged children learn to function in civilized society. For most boys, St. Mary's was a place of survival, not growth. But George Herman Ruth was not most boys. From his very first day, Ruth stood out, and not always in good ways. He was bigger than most boys his age, physically stronger, and utterly fearless. When older boys tried to intimidate him, he fought back with a fury that surprised everyone. When brothers tried to discipline him, he accepted punishment without tears or apologies. But Ruth also showed flashes of something else, a natural charisma that drew other boys to him, and an intelligence that emerged despite his lack of formal education. Most importantly, he possessed what the brothers recognized as an exceptional athletic ability. It was brother Matthias Boatlier who first saw the potential that would eventually transform George Ruth from abandoned child to American icon. Brother Matthias was a giant of a man, 6'6" tall, and weighing nearly 250 pounds. He had hands like ham hocks, and a voice that could silence an entire dormitory with a whisper. Most boys feared him, but Ruth was fascinated by him. Brother Matthias had played baseball in his youth, and he recognized something special in Ruth's natural swing. More importantly, he saw past the boy's anger and defiance to the hurt and abandonment underneath. George, Brother Matthias told the 8-year-old Ruth one afternoon, "You have a choice. You can spend the next 10 years fighting the world and losing, or you can learn to channel that fight into something productive." What followed was the most important relationship of Babe Ruth's life. Brother Matthias became the father that Ruth had never really had. He taught Ruth not just baseball fundamentals, but life lessons that would shape the man Ruth would become. He showed Ruth that strength without discipline was merely destruction, but strength with purpose could move mountains. Under Brother Matthias's guidance, Ruth began to transform. The angry, defiant child was still there, but now that energy was focused on baseball. Ruth spent every free moment practicing pinus, hitting, fielding, pitching. Brother Matthias would pitch to him for hours, teaching him to recognize different types of throws, to time his swing, to place the ball where he wanted it to go. But Brother Matthias taught Ruth more than baseball. He taught him that being abandoned didn't mean being worthless. He taught him that respect had to be earned through actions, not demanded through intimidation. Most importantly, he taught Ruth that everyone deserved a second chance, even a boy that the world had given up on. Ruth's transformation wasn't immediate or easy. There were setbacks, fights, moments when his old anger would surface and threaten to undo all his progress. But Brother Matthias never gave up on him, and gradually, Ruth learned not to give up on himself. By age 12, Ruth had become one of the best athletes St. Mary's had ever seen. He could play any position on the baseball field, but he excelled as a pitcher. His left-handed delivery was so natural and powerful that boys from other schools would come just to watch him throw. More importantly, Ruth had begun to understand his own worth. The abandoned 7-year-old who had arrived at St. Mary's convinced he was unwanted had grown into a teenager who believed he could accomplish anything. But Ruth's time at St. Mary's was about more than just baseball. The brothers made sure that all boys learned practical skills that would help them survive in the world outside. Ruth learned to read and write, though never particularly well. He learned basic mathematics. Most importantly, he learned the value of hard work and persistence. The trade shops at St. Mary's were designed to prepare boys for working-class careers. Ruth was assigned to the tailor shop, where he learned to sew and mend clothing. He wasn't particularly good at it, and he didn't enjoy it, but he understood that it represented security, a way to earn a living, if nothing else worked out. But Ruth's real education was happening on the baseball field. By age 15, he had grown to nearly 6 feet tall and weighed 170 pounds, enormous for a teenager in 1910. His pitching had become so dominant that St. Mary's rarely lost games when he was on the mound. Word of Ruth's abilities began to spread beyond St. Mary's walls. Professional scouts started showing up at games, quietly evaluating the young left-hander who seemed to have unlimited potential. But Ruth wasn't just developing as an athlete. Under Brother Matthias's influence, he was learning what it meant to be a leader. Younger boys looked up to him, not just because of his size and athletic ability, but because he had learned to protect rather than intimidate, to encourage rather than demean. The transformation was remarkable. The boy who had arrived as an unwanted burden had become St. Mary's most promising success story. In 1913, Jack Dunn, owner and manager of the Baltimore Orioles, received a tip about a young pitcher at St. Mary's who might have professional potential. Dunn was skeptical. He'd seen dozens of boys from reform schools over the years, and very few had the mental toughness to succeed in professional baseball. But when Dunn saw Ruth pitch, he immediately understood that this was different. Ruth didn't just have physical ability, he had presence. Even at 18, he commanded attention in ways that most grown men couldn't match. Dunn arranged a meeting with Brother Matthias and the administrators at St. Mary's. The proposal was simple. Ruth could sign with the Orioles as a professional player. It would mean leaving St. Mary's immediately, forfeiting any chance at completing his education there. For Ruth, the decision was easy. Baseball represented freedom, opportunity, and the chance to prove that an abandoned child could become something special. Brother Matthias was more conflicted. He had invested 6 years in helping Ruth develop not just as an athlete, but as a person. He worried that the young man wasn't ready for the temptations and pressures of professional sports. But ultimately, Brother Matthias recognized that Ruth had grown beyond what St. Mary's could offer him. The boy needed to test himself in the larger world. On February 14, 1914, George Herman Ruth signed his first professional baseball contract. Jack Dunn became his legal guardian, since Ruth was still considered a ward of the state. The contract was for $600 for the season, more money than Ruth had ever imagined having. When Ruth walked out of St. Mary's for the final time, Brother Matthias gave him one last piece of advice. Remember, George, you represent more than just yourself now. You represent everyone who believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. Ruth's early professional career was challenging. He was naive about money, easily influenced by teammates who didn't have his best interests at heart, and completely unprepared for life outside the structured environment of St. Mary's. But the foundation that Brother Matthias had helped him build proved solid. When Ruth faced setbacks, and there were many, he drew on the lessons he had learned about persistence and self-worth. When he achieved success, he remembered what it felt like to be abandoned and powerless. Ruth's rapid rise through professional baseball is well documented. What's less well known is how his childhood at St. Mary's continued to influence his behavior throughout his career. Ruth never forgot what it felt like to be unwanted. That's why he spent so much time visiting sick children in hospitals. He understood what it meant to feel alone and scared. That's why he was so generous with autographs and attention for young fans. He remembered being a child that adults ignored or dismissed. Ruth's famous love for children wasn't a publicity stunt or a calculated image decision. It was a direct result of his own childhood experience.
He knew that a moment of attention from a hero could change a child's entire sense of self-worth. Brother Matthias remained an important figure in Ruth's life long after his professional career began. Ruth would return to St. Mary's regularly, bringing equipment for the boys and sharing stories about life in the major leagues. More importantly, he continued to seek Brother Matthias's advice about personal decisions throughout his career. When Ruth was struggling with his marriage, he talked to Brother Matthias. When he was considering retirement, he sought Brother Matthias's counsel. When he faced criticism from the press or fans, Brother Matthias reminded him of how far he had come from that angry 7-year-old who had been abandoned at the school gates. Brother Matthias died in 1944, 4 years before Ruth's own death. Ruth was devastated by the loss. "He was more than a teacher to me," Ruth said at the funeral. "He was the father I never had, and he saved my life in every way a person can be saved." The story of Ruth's transformation at St. Mary's represents something profound about human potential. It demonstrates that circumstances of birth don't determine destiny, that every child deserves someone who believes in their potential, and that sometimes the people who seem most lost are actually closest to finding themselves. Ruth's success wasn't just athletic. Yes, he became the greatest baseball player of his generation, possibly of all time. But more importantly, he became a symbol of what's possible when someone refuses to accept that their beginning determines their ending. The 7-year-old boy who was abandoned at St. Mary's grew up to be beloved by millions. The child who was labeled incorrigible became a role model. The youth who started with nothing became wealthy and famous beyond his wildest dreams. But perhaps most significantly, Ruth never forgot where he came from. His success didn't make him bitter about his childhood or resentful toward those who had abandoned him. Instead, it gave him empathy for others who were struggling, and a deep appreciation for the people who had believed in him when belief seemed impossible. Modern child psychologists study Ruth's story as an example of resilience, the ability to not just survive trauma, but to transform it into strength. They point to several factors that contributed to Ruth's success. His natural athletic ability provided him with a sense of competence. Brother Matthias gave him the stable relationship he needed, and the structured environment of St. Mary's, while harsh, provided the discipline and routine that helped him develop self-control. But there's something else in Ruth's story that can't be explained by psychology or sociology. The mysterious alchemy by which some people transform their pain into purpose, their abandonment into empathy, their disadvantages into determination. Ruth himself never fully understood how he made the journey from unwanted child to American icon. When reporters asked him about his childhood, he would usually deflect with humor or change the subject. The pain of those early years never completely left him, but neither did the gratitude for the people who had helped him transform that pain into something productive. In his later years, Ruth would often say that his greatest accomplishment wasn't any individual baseball record, but the fact that he had proven Brother Matthias right. The monk had seen potential in an angry, abandoned child when no one else could see it, and Ruth had spent his entire career trying to live up to that faith. The American dream promises that anyone can make it if they work hard enough. But Ruth's story suggests something even more powerful, that sometimes the people who seem most lost, most hopeless, most beyond redemption, are actually the ones with the greatest potential to inspire the rest of us. Every time a child faces abandonment, abuse, or neglect, Ruth's story offers hope. Every time someone feels worthless or unwanted, Ruth's transformation reminds us that potential can emerge from the darkest circumstances. The boy who was abandoned at age 7 became a man who was loved by millions. The child who started with nothing became a symbol of everything that's best about the American spirit. And the student who learned about worth and dignity from Brother Matthias spent the rest of his life teaching those same lessons to others. That's the real miracle of Babe Ruth's story, not what he accomplished on a baseball field, but what he proved about the unlimited potential that exists within every human being, no matter how hopeless their beginning might appear.